All right. One of those things that I wished when I went to college is that somebody had actually talked about what kind of jobs you would get when you get out for a particular thing. So what we're going to talk about is the types of jobs that you get when you have experience of or when you're working in database. So I'm going to walk through a number of these things. I have this nice table that I'm showing you. It's in the notes. And I have gone out to a bunch of different sources like Monster. Okay. Job boards, Y Combinator runs one. Angel List. And I'm missing one in that list. But yeah, I've gone out to a bunch of these about a month ago, and I just basically scraped them so I could do some analysis. And I broke down those jobs that are IT related and which ones you might end up doing. And I looked for certain things like database, SQL, SQL, NoSQL, Mongo, DB, Oracle, SQL Server. So I just basically broke them down looking for a set of keywords and said, out of all the development jobs you could get out there, how many of them actually require that you have database experience? And the first thing to take away from this is that just at 48.8%, okay, about half, required that you have some amount of database experience. Now, that should tell you that this is an important thing to be studying. And my total that I did this on for just a period of days, I didn't go back in all the Monster listings. I pulled out Monster listings that were new. Y Combinator does it once a month, so I think this was actually November's listing that I pulled up for Y Combinator because I was in the middle of December and I couldn't find December's for some reason. It's not a big hiring month anyhow, for some reason. So this is not some sort of scientific survey that, I went through and I carefully measured things. I went out and pulled out some stuff so that we could take a look at what kind of jobs. And the first is a database developer. And this is one of the more common ones, but not the most common. And what are they really looking for if they're talking about somebody as a database developer? Okay, you want to have some amount of design. And that's really entity relationship diagrams. We're going to be covering that here in a couple lectures. So that you can at least look at an ERD and say, from this ERD, this is the kind of tables that I would build. Or you want to model something, you can draw up an ERD on a whiteboard and say, this is how these things work together. You need to know about creating tables, how to alter them and manage them, how to get rid of them, how to create indexes, the basic model creation. You need some planning. This is an interesting thing. You say, roughly speaking, we're expecting that we'll have 1 million rows in this table out here, and each one of them is taking about so much space, so how much space do we need? How much should we expect for backup? Stuff like that, roughly speaking. But you also need some planning in terms of, okay, if I'm going to plan for these set of things, and they're putting in this new feature or this kind of thing, where they're going to have these extra tables, what's the plan that's going to transition from what we've got now to what they need in the future, and how are we going to get there? If they're taking a table and splitting it into two, how are we going to make that happen? Or what are the planning things that are going to go into the next version of the product? So there's a bunch of different kinds of planning things. And you need some query development and tuning. This is probably the biggest thing that they're really looking for. SQL originally intended that business people wouldn't need programmers, and consequently they could just write their own queries. It turns out that when you start dealing with everything as sets and indexes, that the queries themselves are quite complex. So these days we have database developers that write queries that quite often are used by other people. business people will often say, you know, I need such and such, and can you write me a query to pull this kind of information out of the database? And then you go look at the model, the design, and go, here's how we're going to get this information, here's how I'm going to write this query, and then you test the query and get the information for them and give them back, here's your data that you're looking for. That's a pretty common thing in a lot of businesses. And testing. The big deal with testing is you've got this huge database, and how do you manage it so that your developers that are just developing code can get a copy of the database and test with it. There's generally some amount of database security, although usually that's more of a DBA thing, and possibly things like backups. As a database developer, you may be involved some in backups, although that's more of a database administrator type thing. But this is some amount of coding, but quite often it's more focused on getting data out of the database or out of a data warehouse and how you access that data. Okay, the last note on database developer is that a database developer is represented about 12% of the jobs that I looked at. So they weren't everything, but it's a significant chunk. The second thing I'd like to talk about is full stack. And full stack, you know, is where we have gone and we've gotten some user that's talking through some network to some kind of an application server to a database. And you're going to be the person that's going to be developing all the way through this stack. This is actually one of the most common. I think it came in at 14.4%. But this means that you're going to have some UI, UX up here knowledge. HTML, CSS, maybe Angular, React. I prefer Vue.js for various reasons. I also do stuff still with jQuery and just a front-end library for style sheets like Bootstrap. And you have to understand how it communicates back and forth. Some networking. You have to understand how an application server works. We're going to cover some stuff on application servers here. And you have to understand how the database is going to interact with that application server. We're going to be doing, that's mostly where we're working, but we're on the bottom side of this piece of stuff. And this, okay, is really common. The things that I would expect, not only are you a database developer, but you've also got to have some network knowledge, some DevOps, and deployment, some maintenance skills, because you've got all of these things, and this is probably running on one server. Sometimes it's a small enough application, it's all in one machine, but more than likely this is on a second server and this is on a third server, and you have to know how to do backups. You have to know how to do recovery if something goes wrong. You may want to actually make this setup so that you have two databases out here that are running in parallel and sharing back and forth. So if you lose one machine, you've got an automatic failover to another machine. And you may want to set it up with some sort of a proxy here that allows you to have redundant servers so that it comes over here and proxies. And that way you've got redundancy in your back end. So this, with about 5 machines involved doing all the pieces, is a pretty common, what I'd call high reliability small business stack that you can generally expect, if you do it right and you work with it, that you'll have less than 5 minutes a year of downtime. Which, you know, that's pretty darn good, considering you're going to build this all yourself. Often this is a small business or a small project. And you also are going to be the person that's going to be in charge of quality assurance, usually. That's interesting, is testing your own code, although I would recommend that even if you are full stack, that you have somebody else in the business actively working with you on testing, or a different person working, if they've got more than one full stack project going, you're trading off doing testing for each other, because you just will not find things in your own code. And you probably are going to want to be able to create test systems because you've got to test this. So creation of test systems and some automated testing. So you've got some continuous in creation, continuous development. That's kind of in your DevOps category here, but CI/CD is pretty important in this. I think I mentioned backups. And almost certainly if you're doing full stack, you're going to be on call. That means that if something goes wrong in the middle of the night, you're going to get a message, you're going to get woken up, so you need to plan on that. Generally speaking, on call means that you won't work once things are deployed as full-time as you would otherwise. Most on-call people think it is right to be in the office or working on stuff about 4 days a week because they have to cover their hours for on-call about 1 day a week. And that's a pretty good split. You'll also see that kind of sort of thing as a database administrator. Now, quite often, I wouldn't say universally, but this is small businesses. This is also a lot of startups. We'll be looking for this. So you go to something like Y Combinator or AngelList that's heavily involved in startups, and my sample may be biased for that reason, but you'll see this sort of a thing. This is the kind of thing that if you're inside a startup, you want to be thinking about being the person that they want to promote to management that's going to be some officer in the company, maybe CTO or head of development. A lot of people that start out doing full stack in a small business with 3 people, basically this is the role they're going to end up in, and they need to be thinking about how they're going to progress into that as they bring other people on to do different pieces of this. So you build something, you find out you've got traction, they raise more money, and you bring on a full-time DevOps person, a full-time QA person that's going to handle a bunch of this, and you bring in a database developer and a front-end developer and a web developer or a graphic designer. So your team of you suddenly becomes a team of 6 in a development department over time. And I've worked with people that have done that a number of times.